Hi there, my name is Melissa and I will be presenting to you today about executive function skills and how they relate to students with disabilities who also come from traumatic backgrounds and poverty. I work at a school in Spring Valley, and the population I work with is 5th and 6th grade students, special education. I taught special day class for many years, and recently we've gone to a different model. So now it's called specialized academic instruction. I have students who range from first grade, kindergarten skills, all the way to grade level reading that have difficulty in very specific areas of academic functioning. All of my students are on IEPs, and they all have an identified organic learning disability or a medical diagnosis of ADHD or both. Some have comorbid, some do not. Today we'll be talking about executive function skills and how they relate to students' grit and poverty, and how these influence children who have traumatic backgrounds. The problem today is that students are coming to school with less and less skills for coping with adversity, and we have seen a sharp increase in students, specifically without disabilities, having major behavior problems at early ages. They have an inability to cope with difficult situations. They don't have the expression they need. They don't have problem-solving skills. Their social skills are severely lacking. And so this project is very near and dear to me. Questions that were posed were, can grit or resilience be taught to students with learning disabilities? And does the explicit teaching of executive function skills correlate with an increase in students' self-perceived resilience? Executive function skills are a type of skills that rely on brain functions, and more specifically, brain functionings at simultaneous times, specific and different functions working together to create an ability of a person to problem solve and remember and take action kind of all at the same time. It briefly talks about how quickly information can be retrieved from the brain. The cognition, which is the thinking about thinking. What were the previous steps that I did? What are the next steps that I need to complete? And also under the umbrella of behavior. So that is the cognitive and emotional and self-regulation of your emotions and reactions. Factors that influence executive function skills are material deprivation, nutritional deprivation, and toxic stress, among others. These three seem to be the biggest factors in children's inability to learn these skills. Material deprivation would be considered books, toys, outdoor activities, learning through play. Many children who live in poverty do not experience these things because they don't have the access to books and educational toys. And parents are often afraid to allow their children to go outside to explore and learn about the environment around them and kind of problem solve. Nutritional deprivation is also an inhibitor because when our bodies grow as children, we need certain nutrients and vitamins and minerals in our body in order to sustain healthy living. When children are deprived of those nutrients, their brains become more susceptible to things such as lead paint and poisoned water that's not clean, And we all know that many of these children live in environments where they have toxic mold, poor water. They have infestations of insects and cockroaches, and they don't get a lot of nutritious foods. They don't have a lot of variety. Parents are struggling and they feed their children what they can afford. And oftentimes it's not a very balanced diet. Toxic stress is also a humongous factor in children's development of executive function skills. Toxic stress is defined as family conflict, separation, household crowding, neighborhood disorder. We see a lot of incarceration, gang affiliation, violence, parents who work 2, 3, 4 jobs and who aren't home, so children are really raising themselves in many ways. Chaos within the home is difficult because it gets very loud and boisterous, and there might be 3, 4, 5 things going on, and so children in their infancy and their growing brains, they kind of shut themselves down and shut out everything because it's all too overstimulating for them. When these things do happen, we have what our brain decides as our fight or flight mode. When that engages, our body increases the level of cortisol, which is the stress hormone. When we have an increase of cortisol in the body, we see children who are unable to cope because they are constantly in that fight or flight mode. That is a place of baseline for them. In other words, baseline is already very stressful. So when other things happen that cause more stress and more instability, we see children shut down and really just stop. They kind of just are where they are. And sometimes it works, and my project, it did work and it was very successful. And sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on the child and the support the child is getting. Executive functions and poverty. Poverty poses the single greatest threat to children's educational equity in this country. Poverty. Not schooling, not language, but poverty. Children who experience poverty experience worse overall health. They have more developmental delays. They have a lower achievement in schools. They have an increase in behavioral disorders. And this is compared to their more advantaged peers, more peers who are a higher level of socioeconomic status. When we look at grit and resilience in regards to executive functioning, we see that resilience is a very, very tricky but important personality trait. Children are indeed very resilient. However, when they do face adversity at a young age, and things might be traumatic, they might have a very traumatic experience, the way that they increase their resilience and work through that trauma or adversity is by having at least one constant, stable person in their life, a caregiver, whether it's a mother, a father, a grandparent, or a teacher. Resilience is defined as an adaptive response to a serious hardship. Every single one of my students has had a trauma in their life, whether it was perpetrated by parents, whether it was incarceration, drug use, domestic violence, some more severe than others. Grit and resilience is defined as an adaptive response to serious hardship. There are 3 interrelated core protective systems that are associated with positive adaptation and the ability to increase your resilience or your grit against adversity and hardship. First is the person's individual capacities, which is their innate being, their brain, their functioning, how they were wired before they were born. The second would be an attachment to a nurturing caregiver. A nurturing caregiver would be classified as somebody who's a constant in that child's life, who is a positive influence and who supports the child through whatever trauma or adversarial circumstances that they might be facing. The third would be a protective community layer, including faith and cultural experiences. Many students have difficulty finding this within their neighborhoods, and so sometimes school is the only place that provides that nurture and that structure that students and children need in their life to thrive. There's been a lot of research on this concept of grit. It was brought to life and kind of thrown into our educational system a few years ago by a woman named Angela Duckworth, who wrote the book on grit, so to speak. And in her book and in her studies, she has found that IQ is not necessarily the determining factor of a student's ability to be successful with school, successful with life, to kind of perhaps grow out of that cycle of poverty. And she does mention that there's two ways to grow this grit. It's from the inside out, which is a student and a person's intrinsic motivation, and then from the outside in, which would be coaches and teachers and pastors or mentors and outside resources that are giving support to that child. So there's these two different ways, and within my realm of experience, I have learned that really there has to be both. They have to have some kind of an intrinsic motivation to want to learn and to grow as a human being. And if that is not there, then it's very difficult to externally motivate children. When we see that, we generally have children that are more needy on the support scale. For instance, they might need a behavior plan. They might need something else that is more outside motivating for their learning and their ability to grow their grit. The results and conclusions after I did my study, my students first watched, at the very beginning of our school year, it was in August, they watched Angela Duckworth's grit video from the TED Talk. And we watched it a few times. The students really enjoyed it, and they thought, they were very, there was a positive reaction to it, my 5th and 6th graders. I think they had never really heard the fact that you don't have to have the highest IQ to be the most successful. I think it gave them a sense of hope and a sense of, maybe I can do this. And these children are already facing poverty and learning disabilities. So for them to hear that, you can do it, and there are people who have, and there are people that do all the time, was very enlightening for them, I think. And they were pretty excited to get started on this path with me and learning these skills. So the first skill that was taught was a skill of planning. I gave all my students, we purchased binders for them, dividers. I purchased a few other materials that they would need to really just get organized within my classroom walls. I have had years and years of children who, I call them stuffers. They stuff their papers in their backpack or their planners, and then they don't open them again until teacher asks them to show it to them. Oftentimes this is where the homework gets lost. This is where the books get lost. This is where kids have no idea what they're even putting in those bags or the papers that are going in there. And so what I wanted to do is really create a way that every student could organize their materials in a way that was simple first, and also that was a step-by-step tutorial. I mean, we went through organization of our binders and planning step by step. So we took the grit quiz, and my students scored themselves on a self-assessment from Angela Duckworth's website on their ability and their grittiness. It was this 8-question survey, and each question was given a point from 1 to 5, I'm sorry. And they scored themselves based on the questions and the answers that were provided, the options. We took this grit quiz again at the end of the intervention. So we had 3 intervention topics that were planning, organization, and self-control. At the end, the grit scores that they retook about 3.5 months later, all students increased. There was a slight increase. It wasn't large, it wasn't humongously eye-opening or anything, but it was an increase. And students seemed to feel more confident taking risks, which is what I was really looking for. I wanted students to really be able to say, no, I'm gonna try it. And if I don't do a good job, then I'm gonna try it again. What I found was after the intervention that students completed tasks at a higher rate. Their classwork and homework was more accurate, and they began to really kind of understand why using a planner is important and why organizing your materials is important. And then also the self-control aspect. Self-control to most of my students is only used when they're angry or frustrated. They didn't really understand it as it pertained to, oh, I have to go sit down and study rather than go play my video games. That's a part of self-control that we focused on for this particular project. It was not about utilizing self-control in the face of anger or fear or frustration. Every single student demonstrated an increase in confidence. I had one who the project was kind of made for. He's a child with autism, high functioning, but very, very easily frustrated. And he scored himself a 1 in the planning area when we first began. And then when we retook that self-assessment, he scored himself a 12. And although it may have been a little bit of an exaggeration, just the fact that he felt like he was doing so much better was all I needed. And I watched him blossom a little bit, and he's been my student for a few years. And so this was really neat for me to see him through and really help him learn how to organize his materials, which is something he's been very, very much struggling with and has been very frustrating for him. In closing, executive function skills are a lifetime of success. When we don't have those successful functioning skills, we see the cycle of poverty, the cycle of adversity, incarceration. It continues and continues. And the reason I really wanted to do this project was because I really feel that it's important that within our classrooms now, in recent years, we really need to be teaching these skills to children, teaching them why it's important and how it can affect them and how it can help. So with that, thank you. And if you have any questions, please refer to the document.